Frank Capra was an Italian-born American film director. He immigrated to the United States with his family in 1903 when he was 6 and eventually became a creative force behind major award-winning fiction films during the 1930s and 40s. He was a highly decorated film director in his era and received great praise for his films. His films were idealistic, sentimental, and patriotic. Capra bluffed his way into silent movies in 1922, and despite total ignorance of movie making, directed and produced a profitable one-reeler. He then learned his craft, advancing from prop man to gag writer to director-producer. His rags to riches story has led critics to believe he was the American dream personified. His major films embodied his flair for improvisation and spontaneity, buoyant humor and sympathy for the populist beliefs of the 1930s. During World War II, upon entering his second war, he was asked by General George C. Marshall, the most senior officer in command of the Army, to create a series of documentaries to get civilians to enlist due to the lack of troops. Here's Capra commenting about the proposal and his view of documentary film in his own words.
As such, he created the Why We Fight series to help give the war a sense of reality. In a recent visit to Washington State University, Frank Capra talked with Professor Humphrey Lindsay of the Cinema Department about his experiences during the war years.
The genesis of this originated in the mind of General Marshall, General George C. Marshall. He was the chief of staff. And we were in the war. We had no troops. We had nothing yet, but we were at war. And he had sent some lectures around to try to lecture to these new kids, 18-year-old hot rodders, we used to call them, you know, that he couldn't, they weren't any more disciplined than you are today. Worse they were. And to think that these kids, with their long suits and their long chains and all their precocious things they were doing at the time, you could put them in uniform and discipline them, and then put them in battle, and then against trained military troops. This worried the general staff, and he wondered how we could put them into the minds of these young kids the necessity of why they were in uniform. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't just something they did just to play games. Mm-hmm. He tried to reach them with lectures. One lecture was better than another, and they couldn't reach another people. He thought of films. Then he thought of who can I get to make films about this thing that it was on his own. I mean,
mm-hmm. And so it's principally his idea.
Principally his idea. That and he came in when I came into his office. He says we'll soon have 12 million kids in uniform, and many of them have never seen a gun. Now, what are they going to do? What are they going to do when they get this terrible disease of homesickness? Mm-hmm. And he said, we'll have to give them some answers why they're in uniform. And he says, I think it could be done with film. It should be done with film. I don't know anything about
nothing about documentaries.
I've never met a documentary in my life. I don't know what a documentary looks like. I don't know anything about war. I don't know anything about anything. And why did he give me this job? But you know, you do what you can do. I remember going to the god of documentaries at the time was this Englishman. Do you remember him?
John Grierson?
John Grierson. And he happened to be in Washington, and somebody says, John Grierson knows everything about, he invented documentaries. I never saw a documentary. I never saw anybody that had made one. I thought documentaries were silly things that rich kooks made, you know. So, this Mr. Grierson, and he was very hard to get to. And I went to him with a hat in hand, and I said, Mr. Grierson, I've been given a job to try to tell our troops why they're in uniform. How do you make a documentary? He looked at me and he says, ha, 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 and walked away.
Oh, goodness.
And I said, why, you son of a bitch, I'm going to show you how to make a documentary. And he got me mad. He got me so mad. I think that's what did the whole trick.
And thus the Why We Fight series came about. The series consisted of 7 films depicting Germany's invasion into other countries with Hitler the head of the dragon. Like he mentioned in the interview, the purpose of the films was to give factual information as to the causes and the events leading up to the United States' entry into the war and the principles for which the fighting stood for. They displayed Germany as a threat to the country's well-being, and if they didn't intervene, what was shown in the films would surely happen to the United States. Because everyone and their mother went to the movies during World War II, the American government found the film industry to be more helpful in convincing the youth. Americans were movie mad and generally believed whatever they saw at the local theater. Capra viewed Leni Riefenstahl's terrifying motion picture Triumph of the Will. Capra describes the film as the ominous prelude of Hitler's Holocaust of hate. Satan couldn't have devised a more blood-chilling super spectacle. This was a segue into his development of the series. His initial thought was how could he counter the film Triumph of the Will?
In 1940, Hitler had conquered France. He was smashing from the air England to pieces. He was brooding about an invasion of Russia. But the United States was not ready for war.
The American Institute of Public Opinion, known as the Gallup poll, asked a representative cross-section of American people, if another war develops in Europe, should America take part again? No. 95%. We the people had spoken. 19 out of 20 of us said, include us out.
Then Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy.
After Pearl Harbor, the Pentagon went to Frank Capra to create a series of films to get America on the side of the conflict in Europe.
The Why We Fight orientation films, fashioned by Hollywood-trained craftsmen.
Capra at that time was one of the most celebrated directors in the country. More than any other director, Capra was very good at making movies about the average American.
College students, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief.
Critics call it Capricorn, but I find his movies unbelievably charming and representative of an America that most of us hope existed at one point.
Yesterday, USA. Sights and sounds left behind for the duration, but never forgotten. The motion picture is seen to that. It follows the soldier to the far reaches of battle.
He was perhaps the best director to tap into the average American's conscience and heart and sensibility about, basically what you're doing is you're asking people to release their children to go to war in a foreign country.
Most of the scenes used to make the Why We Fight series were obtained from American newsreels, official United Nations films, and enemy motion pictures now possessed by the War Department. Capra thought it would be most effective to use the enemy's original film and propaganda in the series in order to expose the enemies with their own images. He took the enemy footage and placed his own narrative over the images, giving a deep look into the meaning and purpose of the war. Through his editing, he created an us versus them image by reframing and showing clips out of their original order and context. All his material, the maps, diagrams, newspaper clippings, and the few historical reenactments were authenticated and prepared by the War Department. An important aspect to point out was the fact that Capra symbolized the Axis power on the maps in black and the Allies in white, comparing the two with good and evil, or light and dark. He also inserted text displaying quotes from the opposing side looking down upon democracy, among them Hitler, as to show Americans what evil was lurking. In this upcoming clip, Capra demonstrates how he uses his tactics to maintain an audience's attention.
For invasion of England. Phase 1. Knock out the Royal Air Force and its bases. Get control of the air and the sea lanes across the Channel. Follow the Blitz plan that had wiped out Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Destroy communication and transport lines. Above all, get command of the air. 2. Pulverize the coastline with dive bombers. Drop parachute troops to take over the airfields and establish beachheads. 3. Actual invasion. Pour the German panzer divisions across in high-speed barges under an umbrella protecting fighter planes. Then send spearheads of armed might to divide, surround, destroy all opposition. That's all there was to it. Then, with the combined sea power of Germany, Britain, Italy, France, and Japan, he could control the seas and tell us where to head in. The torch of freedom flickered low.